Okay, so let's start out with the first section, which is the research administration broad overview. So what's our goal here? We want to understand what are the types of sponsors that fund research. We want to identify the different mechanisms of funding support, what kinds of grants are out there. And then I'm going to show you a lot of places to find key information for NIH funded research. And this is really important because Stanford has some strict rules, as we all know, about authority and who has access to what. And there's so much information about NIH that's publicly available. You don't even have to worry about, what you do or don't have access to. And in Stanford, you can get a lot of it on the NIH's sites. And then we're going to talk a little bit about internal funds that are available for research. This is not our focus, but we do often interact with internal funds. So I want to give you some tips on that. And then what are the compliance guidelines that govern research? There are a lot of rules and regulations. So I want to show you where to find those resources. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the types of sponsors. We've got three main types of sponsors. And here you're going to see me, I'm going to be hopping into our training materials. Again, you should all have access to these. So, everything you're seeing here, you can pull up and read at your leisure later on. So I'm just going to give you the high points here. The types of sponsors, the biggest one is the federal government. And the largest funder of university research projects is the National Institutes of Health, NIH, followed by Department of Defense and National Science Foundation. And so what you want to know about these is these funders issue both general funding announcements in which it's the PI that's proposing the research topic, and they also issue targeted funding announcements in which the agency is requesting proposals on a particular topic or initiative that's of interest to them. And so we will talk about this more in detail, but that's just the broad overview of NIH. Some state governments also fund research of a particular policy interest to them. An example would be the Tobacco-Related Disease Research Program of California. They're often highlighted in Stanford Smart Announcements emails. I'll show you guys, I have a list of mailing lists that you want to make sure that you're on. At Stanford, if you're doing research administration, definitely Smart Announcements is one of them. And a lot of these smaller funding opportunities are going to come through on that email. Local health departments also issue funding opportunities of particular policy interest to them. And they're also highlighted in Smart Announcements, and all of them have their own specific proposal and budget guidelines and strict rules for submission format. I mean, the joke is if you've seen one proposal or you've seen one grant, you've seen one. They are not all the same. Every one of them has their unique set of guidelines, unique budget restrictions, unique proposal attachments, and so on. So be sure you're reading these funding announcements and notices of award carefully every single time. There is no standard issue grant. In addition to the federal government, we have foundations and other nonprofits. Gates Foundation is a great example of one that really loves to fund the work that's being done at Stanford. There are many, many others. Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, Alex's Lemonade Stand. I mean, there are many, many independent foundations. They have a governing board that issues funding announcements that are in line with their charitable mission. And sometimes they may solicit proposals. Other times they may work individually with a researcher. They may really like what they're doing and say, you send me a proposal and we'll put something together. Again, it can come in a lot of different permutations, always going to go through the central offices. We'll talk about those roles and responsibilities a little bit later on. And then finally, we do have research that's funded by business and industry. The big example, of course, is the pharmaceutical companies conducting clinical trials to bring a particular drug or treatment to market. These generally have fewer restrictions. There's usually not a funding opportunity announcement. The budget is developed in a very different way. So, this is something where you're going to want to be working with either the Industrial Contracts Office or the Clinical Trials arm of Research Management Group. So a whole different set of guidelines. We'll be talking about those later. The one thing I want to mention is if it is funded as a fixed price agreement, just be aware that that the investigator may be entitled to retain unspent funds on a business or industry contract. If the balance is greater than 25%, they do have to get additional justification before they can keep that funding. So those are the basic types of funders. And now I want to talk just a little bit about the types of funding mechanisms. So if we go into types of external funding, we'll see we've got a little matrix here that kind of covers the high points. So the basic types of agreements are grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts. So grants are what we see the most often, and they're the most flexible. They provide assistance without many restrictions. The award instrument is usually a notice of award. It may be 4, 5, 6 pages long, typically. And then all the rest of the guidelines are pushed down into the NIH grants policy statement or the funder's program guidelines. Rebudgeting is typically flexible. You can see that equipment title, patent rights are generally favoring us as the recipient. And usually the technical reporting is just once a year, an annual report. Cooperative agreements, they function somewhat like grants, but they have more substantial involvement between the funder and with Stanford. So instead of a general funding announcement, they are going to request a specific application. There's something in particular that they're wanting to do. They want to be heavily involved. They may ask the investigator to travel to Washington, D.C. to meet with them once a year. They may require collaboration among sites that are funded under that opportunity. There may be even a coordinating site that is funded alongside the cooperative agreement. There's more substantial involvement, but generally most of the other guidelines are pretty similar to a grant. They may ask to have a little bit more involvement in patent rights. The technical reporting is more common, more frequent. With cooperative agreements, you may see once every 6 months, sometimes quarterly, but no more than that. And then the final kind of agreement is a contract, and that's actually a transactional relationship where the funder is wanting to procure some specific good or service. It could be a data set, it could be a cell line from Stanford, and so or from whoever gives the best RFP. We hope it's Stanford. So they put out a request for proposal or quote. The award instrument on a contract is hundreds of pages long, with a lot of details, specs, clauses, regulations, just a ton of red tape attached to these federal contracts. The industry contracts may be shorter. It really all depends on that particular company. But as you can see, everything is more restrictive, including patent rights, a lot more prior approval requirements. And the technical requirements in terms of reporting could be really detailed, even as much as monthly. I always tell the horror story of the contract I managed at Ohio State that had 16 different projects. 4 of them were subaward sites. They were all on different reporting schedules that were quarterly. So every month we were submitting 2 to 5 technical reports for this contract. So definitely something where if you find that you're managing one of these, you want to dig deep and figure out exactly what the requirements are. So also on this topic, I want to talk about gifts versus sponsored awards. So, sometimes we'll get funding and we need to decide, is it a gift or a sponsored award? A gift, of course, is when the donor is giving the university, either the department or division or a specific investigator, a certain amount of money to carry forward their research. And so, that's also what a grant is doing, but they're different. First of all, is there a specific scope of work to be performed? Always with a grant, you're going to have a specific scope of work, but a gift could go either way. It could have something specific in the fund authorization, and we'll take a look at that in a minute, or it could have a very general purpose. Second of all, are there reporting requirements? We just saw in that matrix that every grant, cooperative agreement, and contract has reporting requirements, but a donor fund may not. It may just be a conversation between a development officer and the donor to let them know how things are going. Does the sponsor control intellectual property or publication rights? Again, if the answer is yes to this, then it has to go through the central offices for sponsored research. It cannot just be a gift. And then finally, is the sponsor a government entity? If it's a government entity, it has to be a sponsored award. And so if it's yes, it's a sponsor to any of these questions, it's a sponsored award. If it's a gift, check the fund authorization before utilizing. And so I've got here a job aid that kind of helps you to work your way through this to make this decision. I just want to point out attachment A to RPH. This means Research Policy Handbook. We're going to talk about that later, but a lot of times when you have a question about what's going on with a grant or a gift, any kind of fund, the Research Policy Handbook is going to give you a lot of details about how to proceed. And then I've also got a template saved in here of conditions of a gift letter. Again, this is just to help you out. If you find that you're working on a gift and you need to figure out how to get it set up properly, you've got some resources in here. So I did want to show you guys, like, what does a fund authorization look like? So you can either go into FFIT or BI, but here's an example of what does a gift authorization say. Here's a very general one. It says here, this is one of our investigators and Division of Nephrology. The fund should be used to support the research of Dr. Glenn Chertow as long as he's a member of the faculty. If any amount remains, Dr. Chertow is not a member of the faculty, the fund should be used to support nephrology research at the discretion of the chief. So that's a really broad fund authorization. There's not too much to worry about there. So, and then on the other hand, you may have, actually, I'll go into BI and show you guys the other way that you can look up the fund authorization is by going into BI and looking in the financial reporting directory. It's just going to take me a minute to come up. And then you go to PTA inquiry, which is actually our first option here. And you can actually pull up the fund authorization here as well. So GHHBB, I'm going to take a look at now. I'm going to hit apply. This is going to give me, here's my award number. And if I right click on it, I've got an action link for the fund authorization. So I can take a look at what am I allowed to spend on this particular one. This one has, as you can see, it's really involved, right? So it's actually naming the investigators that they want to be involved. And it says, if the full amount is not required, then the fund for the purpose stated above, it shall be used under the direction of the Dean of the School of Medicine for related purposes after consulting with us and taking into account our special interest as evidenced by the purpose described above. So you can see there are very different fund authorization between those two gifts. So that's why you want to be careful when you are working on these awards. So we're going to talk more about internal funds in our breakout room sessions, but just wanted to give you the overview there.